Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. We're going to catch up again today with kind of a thread of topics that we've been discussing in the past about the kind of movement of group psychology and social pressure and how that can affect public discourse in a highly politicized environment. So you've said something online and now you are canceled. But are you really? In the marketplace of ideas, speech has consequences. People protesting cancel culture are really just complaining that the problematic things that they've said have been rejected by the more enlightened society who will not tolerate wrongness in public discourse. That's a good thing, right? Well, maybe some people have lost their jobs. Maybe they've lost opportunities, friends, social standing, and careers over the things they've said, even things which can actually be supported by objective, non-politicized review of the data. Maybe others who would actually agree with them have actually silenced themselves because of fear of the same sort of public shaming and demonization. Maybe there's a pervasive fear that prevents open, honest dialogue because the shifting landscape of acceptable speech is really hard to predict. Is this the much protested cancel culture? How can we tell the difference between cancellation and the reasonable consequences of controversial speech? Well, Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, includes a helpful chapter which draws this distinction quite well. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about it. So if you've been watching the podcast, you'll know that in the past, I've made reference to this book, Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch. And I think it's one of the most clear and concise defenses of the concept of free speech that we've seen. You don't have to dive into a bunch of, Lockean philosophy or anything like that. It just kind of takes some very straightforward arguments for why it's so important that we allow people the freedom to express ideas, and rather than engage them with violence or engage them with coercion, we respond to those controversial ideas with more speech. And I highly recommend, if you follow the channel, definitely order this book on Amazon and check it out. There are also a couple of videos that I'll put in the notes where he summarizes his argument really well. This was written in the wake of something that happened when I was young, which was called the Salman Rushdie affair with the Satanic Verses. And there was an author who wrote a book which the Ayatollah Khomeini believed was blasphemous to Islam and to the Prophet Muhammad. And as a result, he issued a fatwa that called for the murder of Salman Rushdie. And it was a unique moment because the West, which had previously championed the idea of free speech and free expression, seemed to kind of have a moment of doubt about the importance and value of free speech. We've seen this come up again and again, but it's the landscape on which this discussion takes place, and I highly encourage you to recommend that, because when we talk about the issue of cancel culture, it's helpful to kind of draw some extremes. And certainly writing a book and then having a religious figure say that you should be put to death because of that book is one of the most extreme forms of cancel culture that could exist. And people actually did die. While Salman Rushdie went into hiding for something like 9 years, people who worked on the publication and translation of the book actually did end up dying because they were caught in the kind of the environment of Rushdie, because the concept was that not only was he deserving of death, but anyone else who stood next to him, who took part in bringing this book to being, also deserved death. And that is a form of cancellation that is hard to argue in favor of, but the West seemed to not be able to articulate a really good defense against that. And there's a bunch of reasons why, which if you study religious extremism and you look at what happened when people tried to draw figures of the Prophet Muhammad, you can see why there was a great deal of fear in how to deal with this issue. But Jonathan Rauch recently wrote a follow-up to that book called The Constitution of Knowledge. I'll go ahead and put that up on our screen now. This is Jonathan Ross. He's the author. The Constitution of Knowledge takes another stab at explaining how the system that we've developed in the West works in order to pursue truth in an environment where people are given the freedom to approach that truth without having to tiptoe around political landmines. And it describes a set of rules that have evolved in Western liberal societies that have given people the freedom to settle disputes over controversial ideas with rationality, logic, and speech rather than violence. And violence or coercion. And he does just a really good job. If you get a chance, definitely start with the first book and follow it up with this one. I was reading the book with much interest and came across this chapter that really just jumped out at me because we're at a moment right now where, as a society, we're struggling with this issue of free speech. And you may not have felt it yourself, but if you haven't, you will one day, which is that you are going to, at some point, encounter yourself, someone you love, or maybe somebody that you respect, having said something online that will get consequences which may seem disproportionate in today's environment compared to before. Okay, let me just close that. Leave. Okay, so but on the other hand, there are people who say things that may be considered just really deplorable. And in some cases, maybe they're so terrible that people decide, you know what, I don't want to be associated with you. I don't want to kind of engage with you. And some people may see that as reasonable consequences for people holding problematic views. And especially when we say, hey, well, you know, censorship, when the government does it, is bad. But if we are simply people talking in an open forum and you say something that is so offensive, you lose friends, you lose social standing, that's just a reasonable consequence for you holding ideas which society has come to acknowledge are wrong and problematic and have a moral dimension that kind of paints you as a wrong and bad person. And so with that defense of the protest of cancel culture that's out there, the question comes like, how can we tell the difference? When is it cancel culture? When is it not cancel culture? And if you follow my channel, you know that, you know, I was the target of a cancellation when I wrote a satirical piece that was a type of pseudepigrapha, which portrayed a website that looked very much like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church's website, with the prophet of the church taking a position which apologized for past teachings and doctrine and policies that the church held, which were racist. Now, those past teachings and doctrines were factual. They were not a distortion, but in the satire apology that I wrote, I had the prophet of the current church actually taking a degree of accountability and contrition and making an apology, and then making a few other steps that would serve to reconcile the divide that does still exist in the hearts of many people when they examine the history of the church. Well, in the wake of that, a lot of people started saying, well, actually, this is not a provocative piece of satire. This is an example of white supremacy. And it reveals that the author of this piece, myself, John Streeter, is in fact a racist bigot. He's, you know, I got some voicemail saying that I was a piece of human garbage. And people started saying that what I had done was an example of a white savior complex, and that I was described as a hot potato, which meant basically that if people were friends with me or defended me, they were complicit in the badness that I represented. And I had, you know, worked over a couple of years up to that point, building good relationships and goodwill with people that I respected a great deal, including Mormon historians, people who had contributed a great deal to the discussion of some of the realities about the Mormon church. And I saw several of them unfriend me and denounce me. And so I got a little bit of a taste of this, which it didn't make sense to me at the time because I had what was probably a conventional understanding of what racism was and what white supremacy was. And a lot of my investigations and reading since that time have been really to try to get a handle around what is this new social phenomenon that we're having, where landscapes can shift so quickly, and where group psychology and mob mentality end up changing people's perspectives on things in a very rapid fashion. When I say changing people's perspectives, that the piece that I wrote and getting it in a website format didn't involve just myself, but I saw other people who were involved in doing it change their perspective as they started to read and started to believe that what had happened was actually a form of white supremacy. And so I just got to see the way that it transforms people's perspectives. And if you'll note, recently on the YouTube channel, there's been a lot of exploration of the phenomenon of how these things have happened. So that's kind of where we get to this point, because I think it's important to see. You'll also note recently in online social spaces of people interested in Mormonism, there was a church leader by the name of Brad Wilcox who was recorded giving a talk. And in the context of his talk, he made some statements that people believed to be further examples of Mormon racism. And you got to see again that this social phenomenon of somebody being canceled online, and some people saying, particularly defenders of the church, saying this is cancel culture, it's bad for our society, we don't want to demonize somebody and paint them all as completely 100% bad or exaggerate the impact of their words. We want to respond to them rationally without completely destroying a person. Whereas the people who saw this as a way to make further inroads in a fight against the church said, no, we need to make as big a deal as possible about this, because we need to, use it as, a great weapon in our ideological fight against the church. And I can see both sides of that quest based on what you believe the church represents in our society, in the lives of individuals who were involved in it. And it's I think I've started having less of a black and white view of that question of what the church represents, both in society and in the lives of the people who are involved in it. So with that bit of background, I want to go ahead and go into this book. This is from the Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth by Jonathan Rosch. And I'm just going to bring up my Kindle screen here. And Kindle. And there are a couple of things that will come up in the context of this discussion. One of them is what he describes as the Constitution of Knowledge. And just so that you know, that in the book, if you read it, you'll get a further in-depth explanation of it. But the Constitution of Knowledge is just kind of the unofficial set of rules that Western liberal societies have developed for how we pursue truth. And some of those rules are that you should have very wide expanse of freedom of speech. You should be able to say controversial things, because in many instances, some of the things that were previously considered to be controversial were discovered to be true. But if you had clamped down on those controversial things and never allowed that speech to take place, we never would have evolved in that understanding of truth. And there's several different examples, both in the objective reality realm as well as in the moral realm, of that being a very true thing. And so the principle of defending the freedom of speech and allowing people to respond with more speech is very core to that. And drawing a distinction for that unwritten set of rules that guides us in our pursuit of truth between what is happening in the realm of social media and modern discourse, where people are really afraid to speak because they're afraid of the type of consequences that are described as cancel culture, point to an important contrast. And in describing these different things, and he makes a strong case against cancel culture, but then he acknowledges that there's this rebuttal that's out there, which is that it's not cancel culture, it's just consequences. It's just valid criticism. Since the government isn't the one imposing these consequences onto people, then it is just the marketplace of ideas. And so we really need to just let that be and not criticize it as cancel culture or say that it shouldn't happen. So the section is called, Am I Canceling You Right Now? And I'll just read it and we'll discuss. Am I canceling you right now? But wait, might not the indictment of cancellation itself be a kind of canceling? Didn't I just insist that words are not bullets? But here I am, condemning cancelers as people who are merely engaging in criticism. Sure, death threats and harassment should be off limits, and what happened to Rushdie was totally unacceptable. Someone who makes controversial statements should expect to be criticized. If a lot of people are appalled by something, shouldn't they speak up against it? Isn't that the whole point of free speech? Even demands for someone's firing are expressions of opinion. Why shouldn't Brandon Ike's critics say he's unfit to lead Mozilla? This is an example of a past cancel culture event where the leader of Mozilla, a popular web browser, was discovered to have problematic tweets, and he was called out and subsequently fired from his job. Why shouldn't they say he's unfit to lead Mozilla if that's what they think? Therefore, continues the argument, the whole idea of cancellation is at best meaningless and at worst just another way to shut down debate. Government inhibition of speech is wrong, full stop, wrote Elizabeth Pachudio. I don't know how to pronounce that. When the public conversation about canceling reached a boiling point in 2020. Threatened and actual violence in retaliation for speech are wrong, full stop. Firings, deplatformings, and social stigma for self-expression are not always wrong. They are wrong on a case-by-case basis. Hannah Georges, another writer, put the point concisely. Critical tweets are not censorship. Now, Georges and Picciuto, these two prior quotes, had a point. To address it, we must be a bit more specific about what canceling, or coercive conformity, as I think of it, what it is and what it is not. Both criticism and coercive conformity take the form of people arguing about something, but they belong to very different worlds. Criticism expresses arguments or evidence with the goal of influencing opinion through rational persuasion. It belongs to the realm of truth-seeking. Canceling belongs to the realm of propaganda warfare. It seeks to organize and manipulate a social or media environment to demoralize, deplatform, isolate, or intimidate an adversary. Like disinformation and trolling, its interest is not in discovering knowledge, but in shaping the information battlefield. In practice, the line between criticizing someone and canceling her can be fuzzy and subjective, and we will sometimes have to argue about where to draw it. Reasonable people could dispute whether the firing of the Times op-ed editor shows intolerance or reasonable editorial judgment. Again, referencing a prior cancellation where an op-ed editor allowed something to be published and because of public outcry lost their job. Shouting canceling profligately makes you part of the problem and turns whom shaming whom into a finger-pointing contest. Remember, the journalist Jesse Singal quipped, "The way to fight the shaming of online shamers is to shame the shamers' shamers." One could grant that point and still recognize that in principle, criticizing and canceling are different kinds of things, pointing to very different values. Criticism seeks to engage in conversations and identify error. Canceling seeks to stigmatize conversations and punish the errant. Criticism cares about whether statements are true. Canceling cares about their social effects. Criticism exploits viewpoint diversity. Canceling imposes viewpoint conformity. Criticism is a substitute for social punishment. We kill our hypotheses rather than each other. Canceling is a form of social punishment. We kill your hypothesis by killing you socially. Criticism reflects the values of the constitution of knowledge, seeking to inquire and learn. Canceling reflects the values of propaganda, seeking to manipulate the information environment. How to tell the difference? When are you being canceled as opposed to criticized? Here's some good diagnostic indicators. Okay, so now here he's going to go into several different facets. And for me, this was just so good at not only when something happens to you, but also when you engage in online discourse about something controversial that somebody said. Because the way that you respond to criticism reflects your values both about how we should conduct each other in social environments, both in person and online, but also your values as to whether the truth matters and whether or not you should draw broad generalizations about somebody based on one interpretation of one thing that they said. So let's continue. These are good diagnostic indicators. He's divided these into a few categories and tried to draw the distinction between cancel culture, or what he calls coercive conformity, because it's a very good description of what the intention of cancel culture is, or this idea that in the constitution of knowledge, in a liberal society based on rationality and free speech, you respond to problematic or controversial speech with more speech, with further explanation of ideas, with argument and rationality, not with coerciveness or shaming. Okay, putativeness. Does what is being said to or about you have the goal or foreseeable effect of jeopardizing your livelihood or isolating you socially? Are people denouncing you to your employer, your professional groups, your social connections? Are you being blacklisted from jobs and social opportunities? The constitution of knowledge punishes the idea, not the person. Cancel culture punishes the person, not the idea. So I looked at each of these things and reflected on my own experience in the written apology and the consequences that I experienced from that. And one of the things that some people did is they looked up where I worked, and then they started having online discussions about whether or not they should call my employer and let them know that they had hired a racist and try to get me fired. I had people pointing out whether or not somebody was friends with me so that they could further be drawn into the crossfire. And I had somebody look into the names and identities of my children and then start asking me questions about them and trying to drag them into the discussion as further fodder for the criticism. So if I look at those types of consequences and then ask me, was the discourse around this punitive, or was it, if you want to make an argument for what I did, but still separate me as a person from it, then that's a different thing from trying to have all of these punishments happen to me. And you can look at other ways when we look at the Brad Wilcox example. This is where, when you're discussing something that you believe to be racist, calling a person racist is in that putative category, because you can separate a person who holds racist ideas or beliefs and say what they said was racist. They're good people, or they may be misguided people, but a person can lay down a racist idea and take on an idea that is not racist. On top of that, we live in an environment now where the term racist itself is expansive. People are adding more things onto what could be labeled racist, and not everybody agrees on what actually should be labeled racist. So there's a lot of dimensions to that, whereas if you apply that label to the individual themselves, then they get all of the social stigma, all the demonization, when that shouldn't really be your goal. If you want to make an argument that is persuasive, that can change somebody's perspective, that can have a real effect in their life and in the public discourse, you want to avoid that. You want to allow people to be able to save face and save dignity, but still listen to your ideas. So this dimension of punitiveness is an important one to examine. When you are part of a pylon of somebody that said something problematic, pause and ask yourself, wait a second, am I doing and saying things whose goal is to punish the person, or to make an argument for a better way of thinking about things and separate the idea, or what I consider to be the controversial statement, from the person themselves? Next, deplatforming. Are campaigners attempting to prevent you from publishing your work, giving speech, attending meetings? Are they claiming that allowing you to be heard is violence or makes them unsafe? The constitution of knowledge relies on diversity of expression. Cancel culture prevents it. And this, if you've been following our series on postmodernism, this is alluding to one of the principles that comes out of that, which is the equation of violence with speech. Because if you say that certain ideas or certain speech is a form of violence, then you add weight to the argument that you should be able to censor it, silence it, remove it from an environment. If you're having a online debate, if you're having a conference, and you can label a position that one of the attendees, one of the debaters, or one of the invited speakers has as violence, then you can say that they are a danger to our environment simply by allowing them to speak. And you can effectively silence them. It doesn't require any government coercion, but you can take those ideas completely out of the chat, so to speak. And when you look at the history of how truth has been discovered in our society, it's really by allowing those ideas that are considered wrong to play out on the stage that you get closer to truth. And that is not to say that all of these controversial beliefs or statements are in fact truth waiting to be hidden. But what it's saying is that in the debate, in the discussion that happens as a result of allowing those ideas to participate in the marketplace of ideas, we achieve a closer understanding to truth in the future. And it does not require that, it's not to say that those things are going to be true. We just have to let that play out. It's that it's in that conflict of perspectives and ideas that happens in discussion, in debate, that we find truth in the future. Okay, next is grandstanding. Is the tone of the discourse ad hominem, ritualistic, posturing, accusatory, outraged? Are people flattening distinctions, demonizing you, slinging inflammatory labels, and engaging in moral one-upmanship? Are people ignoring what you actually said and talking about you, but not to you? The constitution of knowledge rewards careful, rational argumentation. Cancel culture rewards demagoguery. If you find that people are labeling you as a blanket racist bigot or whatever, if they're taking a bad faith interpretation of something that you said and blowing it completely out of proportion and basically painting you with a very broad brush based on a narrow interpretation of something that you said, and doing it very loudly in very public forums in order to turn people's opinion about the individual against them without actually pulling apart and looking at the context of the statements or any gray areas. If it's a statement made on a complex issue for which there can be many different opinions, we're finding frequently that only one opinion is allowed a safe space, and all of the opinions, regardless of nuance, are labeled as bigoted or hateful. And that closes down a deeper, more complex understanding of the issues at hand. And so it narrows our public discourse. It can cause harm. If you want to see how this happens, just look at the trans issue and the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. You'll find that medical professionals who are just trying to understand a phenomenon that is objectively, undeniably happening in our society are trying to gather data and publish about it. And rather than saying, wow, this is a complex issue, we need to understand all the different dimensions about this, activists who take a very one-sided political perspective on the issue of trans people have gotten the researchers deplatformed and demonized, and they'll usually come up with a word for people who have anything but the most radical opinion on these things. And so you'll see the word TERF thrown around, and it's a way to demonize these people. And in doing so, they're very vocal about it. And that grandstanding and all of the vitriol and all of the discussion that happens online ends up serving as a form of pressure on institutions to use their own mechanisms to silence people. So in the cases of ROGD, the journal that published that data ended up having to issue a correction or a retraction, and people then saw the researcher and that data as blacklisted from any further discourse. If you wanted to bring up that data or bring up that researcher, then you yourself would be labeled a TERF or someone who had wrongness. And so it's a very pervasive effect of how this has the ability to silence perspectives, and grandstanding is a big part of that. Okay, so reductionism. Are you being condemned on the basis of one or two things you may have said or done, taken in isolation and shorn of context? Are people collapsing the totality of your character and career down to a single mistake or offense, without regard to other contributions or accomplishments? The constitution of knowledge builds reputational credibility over decades. Cancel culture demolishes it overnight. And this is one where I think the Brad Wilcox example is pretty demonstrative of this effect. Now, Brad Wilcox, if you're a critic of the church, you see him as somebody who goes out, makes a statement that can be interpreted as racist, and you want to blow that up as much as possible. Say Brad Wilcox is racist, and by extension, anyone who defends him is racist. And it doesn't matter any other aspect of who Brad Wilcox is, what he has taught, what he believes, how he conducts himself in public life. They get brandished as racist. And you'll see this happens quite a bit just in terms of when you are a believing Mormon, you'll look at your life and you'll say, I really have accepted the idea that, there's racial distinctions are not something that has any bearing on somebody's worthiness or anything. And you'll conduct your life in a way that is not racist according to those terms. But then you leave the church, you study the history of the things that the prophets have said in the past in the church. And then you go back in and then you'll say the Mormon church is racist. And you'll make that argument in an all-encompassing way, kind of blanking out the fact that the church itself has made a lot of progress on the theme of racism. And there's still remnants of that racism there, but it's much more powerful, much more condemning to say the church is racist and all of the members are complicit in that racism if they don't immediately denounce X, Y, and Z. And that type of reductionism doesn't give people a way to deal with this complex issue in a way that humanizes them, and it tends to create more conflict, create more resentment in a way that's going to make it harder for your message to be heard. So if you have relationships, if you're an ex-Mormon, you're in a relationship with family members who are still in the church, going that route isn't going to advance your goals of maintaining those relationships and being able to be persuasive of your perspective on your family members, and can actually hurt your family relationships. So just be careful how heavily you wield that tool of reductionism. And remember, you don't want that to be used against you. Orchestration. Does criticism appear to be organized and targeted? Are the organizers recruiting others to pile on? Are you being swarmed and brigaded? Are people hunting through your work and scouring social media to find ammunition to use against you? The constitution of knowledge relies on independent observers. Cancel culture relies on mob action. If you looked at some of the past episodes that we covered, for example, the issues of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the episode on the third wave, you'll see how there are social forces that get people when some wrongthink is pointed out. There's a lot of incentive for you to join the throng of voices that are standing on the right side of history, pointing their finger at the wrong thinkers and calling them out. There's a lot of personal validation, personal solidarity with, the right thinkers that happens. If you were to say, well, hold on a second, let's back off, let's show a measure of restraint in the way that we criticize someone, then people will immediately lump you in with the wrong thinkers. And so even trying to be a moderate voice in this highly charged environment immediately pushes you onto the side of those who are being condemned. And so it's just a social phenomenon that leads towards radicalization. It leads towards more extreme statements, because if you can say something even more condemnatory towards the villains, if you can be even more extreme in the way that you want to call them out and impose consequences on it, then you're being more pure, you're being more good, and that just snowballs, and people want to be even more virtuous in that way. And that's where virtue signaling can lead to radicalization, when it combines with the groupthink mass psychology that as humans we're all vulnerable to. Okay. So, secondary boycotts. Is there an explicit or implicit threat that anyone who supports you will get the same treatment that you're receiving? Are people putting pressure on employees and professional colleagues to fire you or to stop associating with you? Do people who defend you criticize the campaign against you? Do people who defend you and criticize the campaigns against you have to fear the consequences? The constitution of knowledge relies on independent judgment. Cancel culture relies on bullying. This is one point I think where it's really important for you to step back and ask yourself how you are conducting your own behavior when you see a mob of people calling out somebody for something problematic in what they said. Because this is not to make the case that you shouldn't criticize problematic things, but that you should be very thoughtful in the nature of your criticism, in that you're criticizing and responding to ideas while preserving the humanity and the dignity of the person, and that you are mindful of the way that the criticism happens, in that you don't demonize other people for having friendships with that person or being family members of that person, and that you don't go after downstream secondary consequences that are only justified really by seeing the person themselves as a demon, not by looking at the idea. Next is inaccuracy. Are the things being said about you incorrect? Do the people saying them seem to not even care about veracity? Do they feel at liberty to distort your words, ignore corrections, and make false accusations? The constitution of knowledge puts accuracy ahead of politics, and cancel culture puts politics ahead of accuracy. This is something that becomes really important when you talk about objective things. You can look at how the public discourse about COVID-19, about the trans issue, have come, and people will try to bring objective data to the public discourse because that objective data might lead to something that is politically not in favor at the time, then out come the ad hominem attacks, out come the invalidation, rather than responding to the data, analyzing, interpreting the data, putting it in context, see if it justifies the argument that it's being out in support of. You simply demonize someone, or as we've seen in our social media platforms, you ghost them or deplatform them or shadow ban them. And that's why we're not going to discover new data which differs from our current understanding and knowledge if you just label all new or divergent data as wrong. People have come out with this idea of trust the science, when science is not a body of unquestionable truth. Science is a method whereby we question existing understanding of truth in a very methodical and organized fashion in order to reach truth that we don't currently have. And it requires you to be able to bring out controversial data, because it's that data that doesn't quite fit our current understanding, which helps us expand our view. When, as a society, we have established a precedent and a habit of taking any divergent data and silencing it, deplatforming it, labeling it as violence or hate or wrongthink without applying rationality, analysis, and refutation based on empiricism, then we're closing off opportunities for understanding, for growth, for truth. And if you find that the people whose side that you've jumped on the bandwagon of start to say things like, well, it's only impact over intent, it doesn't matter whether or not what we're saying is correct about what you said, only that we're on the right side of history, or only that we're standing up for some marginalized group, regardless of whether or not the truth of something is said, then you just have to realize, okay, you're lumping yourself into a group of people who prioritize politics over truth or accuracy. And that's something that it should be a red flag for you to step back and say, do I want to throw my hat in with this group, or do I want to at least step back and try to listen to other perspectives and other voices and see if maybe I deepen my own understanding of the issue, and maybe I can't see it as just a black and white, us versus them, good versus bad issue. The more of those information warfare tactics that you are encountering, the surer you can be that you are being canceled, not criticized. Most of the time, in real life, the difference will not be hard to see. And I'll close it off right there. That section of the book, as I was reading it, just came to me as really insightful and really kind of an important list of questions for you to ask about any cancellation event. And I kind of frame this as, how to understand things when you're being canceled. And certainly I can look at it through that lens with my own experience. But I think the more important way to take this type of discussion is really to pause in the midst of participating in a social media mob event to call out and demonize someone. Just pause and ask yourself, what is the nature of the type of criticism that I myself am giving in this public discourse? The people that I'm aligning with in my criticisms, are they reflecting more of a cancel culture dimension or coercive conformity, which I think is a better term than cancel culture, because it speaks to the coercive nature of the way that you respond to controversial statements rather than the rational, empiric nature that you would respond in what Rausch is calling the constitution of knowledge. Just kind of decide how you are going to respond when one of those things happen, because the decision that you make and the way that you offer criticism reflects your values. And, we all have to deal with these controversial issues and how we're going to understand them and move forward. But if you move towards a coercive conformity paradigm, then you're setting yourself and our society up to the same pathway that we can study history and find other coercive conformity paradigms leading them down to, and it usually ends up in violence, real violence, not verbal violence or starvation or any number of things that happen when you disrupt the mechanisms of truth-seeking and understanding that Western liberal societies have built on, that have given us the degree of freedom and prosperity that we have. So with that being said, this is called Talk on Things and Stuff. I have 15 minutes. I will go ahead and open up the phone lines. I have far viewers than I used to because I haven't been doing this as much or as frequently. So I'm sure all the algorithms have put me way down on the ranking. But if you would like to call and maybe offer your own perspective on some of this stuff, you can dial 210-422-2222. And let's see here if I have. Boop. Okay, the number is 210-422-2222. If you'd like to call, you can share some of your thoughts and perspectives on this by way of what has... Okay, well, let's see what we got. Hello, you are on Talk and Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Hopefully the audience can hear. What's on your mind?
John, it's your friend FW.
Oh, hey, what's going on?
Haven't talked to you in a while. Lots of things. Hope you're doing okay. And also, excellent. I also hope that there's enough social credit between the two of us for me to say the things that I want to say in the spirit of friendly discussion. Sure. I trust that there is, because I know you're this is kind of what you're about here. So, okay, I'm so glad that I caught you here because I've been thinking about you so much lately, weighing out kind of the general theme that you've been addressing lately on your channel, which, if I'm going to summarize from my standpoint, is kind of like, basically in a nutshell, beware of this woke mob mentality, because it can lead people to do irrational things and etc. Is that a fair
Yeah, I think in the modern moment, we're calling the name woke has been applied to it. But if you go back over history, movements that tend to have these group psychology dimensions to it have had a number of different names. Whether you want to call it the Red Guard or Bolsheviks or however you want to call it, then yeah, certainly that's a good way to describe it in the current framing.
Yeah, just trying to use common language just for the sake of putting a nice little bow on it. Anyway, so I think about that conversation when I hear these news stories come up about, for instance, you live in Texas, and some of the recent legislation coming out about trans kids in Texas, and then in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill, and I'm hearing about the book bannings and all these things. And I think, gosh, I look at the political spectrum in our country right now, and I see that the problem that you're addressing, and I I mean, valid points. I'm not like necessarily disagreeing, but I also see what's happening on the other side. And for me, it kind of boils down to like, maybe it's too much of a simplification to boil it down this way, but like on one side, you have the social pressure of the like, you know, woke mob or whatever you want to call it, you know, these social media, brigading or whatever, where you kind of dogpile on people, and you made your case there. But then on the other side, it seems like you have maybe, from my perspective, a little bit more teeth, where you have people enacting like actual legislation that says like, talk about cancel culture, you can't even say certain words. And this is now backed by like government, and you could have like CPS coming to your house to like take your kids. You know, that's the story anyway, you know. And that to me seems a little bit scarier. And I know that it's kind of like one side of the seat is the pushback against the other, but I'm looking at them and it's not like a 50-50 kind of a thing. I'm a little more scared about the conservative side. I mean, I would even say that like there's a contingent of our population that tried to cancel democracy 2 years, a year ago. You know, like that is scary to me, because there's people like actually with actual power, not just. I'm not saying that like social influence isn't power, because it is, but it's more of like an influence type of power versus like these people could potentially like send police to arrest you or imprison you or something if it went any further. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that coming from the other side. And
well, yeah, no, that's okay. Well, I mean, I'm happy to have you stay on the line. I think your concerns are completely legitimate, and they're backed by history. And I think probably when I was growing up, the discussions that we're having were a little bit more flip on the other side, where you would have what would be called like the Christian conservative movement more on the side of censorship, like banning things that they were branding as satanic or unbiblical, and using you know, the power of government to take their ideology and try to make it the way that society is. And that impulse is there. And I think the thing to be cautious of in how we navigate things now is just remembering that there are extremists on both sides. There are extreme elements on both sides. And even when I and others make, you know, warnings about the woke culture sort of thing, that's not to say that we don't agree with some of the criticisms that are being done in part of public discourse. It's just to say that the way that we conduct public discourse is important, and that things can go haywire, and they can go haywire fairly rapidly when certain effective ways of demonizing your opponents and gaining social clout take hold. And so one of the things that is very powerful as a way of doing things is controlling the framing of the narrative. And that struggle between two different sides of a strong political ideological point, controlling the framing of the narrative paints how people perceive certain issues. And one of the most powerful ways to control the framing of the narrative is to apply a label to something in question. So you describe the Florida bill as the Don't Say Gay bill. And so if you're going to look at it as the Don't Say Gay bill, then that already gives you a framing for what that bill represents. It's important, if you're going to go ahead and adopt that framing, that you say, okay, this is how I'm going to see the bill, but I want to understand at least, because I think it's important to say, what does the other side see it as? Do they also call it the Don't Say Gay bill? Is that actually its name? What is their perspective? Like, what are the arguments, the actual arguments they're making from their side in good faith? Not what is the arguments that my side says their side is making, but what is the arguments they have? And go and explore that. And you'll find that they're not calling it the Don't Say Gay bill. They're calling it the Parental Rights and Education bill or something like that. And it's different from the name of the actual bill itself. And then just look like, if they're calling it this, why are they calling it this? What are the things that they're concerned about? And then that's where you can go in and see what the discourse is. You know, try to withhold judgment for a little bit, just see what the concerns on both sides are. And then it does require you to do a little bit of background investigation about claims that are made on both sides about the nature of reality and society and gender and all these other things. And as you explore your own perspective on the issues behind this particular bill, then you can decide whether or not calling it the Don't Say Gay bill or the Parental Rights and Education bill, whether each of those narrative framings is legitimate or illegitimate, and how you want to look at that issue. And I think that's where, one of the things that they said here is that the cancel culture paradigm is really about propaganda, bullying, and shaping the information landscape. And whether you're doing that on a far right or a far left side, it's going to shape how people who are new to the conversation see the different sides. And they're going to see the other side as coercive and manipulative and applying forms of power. And trying to ask yourself, what is propaganda and what is not propaganda, or what is objective data, is important, because trying to understand how propaganda colors and frames an entire discussion about certain issues is pretty important. And I found that in the exploration of either political or social issues, it can kind of change how you understand an issue based on how it's framed.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely understand that, and I think that the last thing I would add from my perspective is, well, to come back to another episode that you did, which I got through most of it, but not all of it. We were talking about Foucault and
oh yes, the 5-hour postmodernism episode.
Yeah. And anyway, like that was really interesting to me, and I understand. I think the perspective that you had, is it Chris? What's it? The other guy? Yeah, Chris. Kind of like the position that you were laying out. But what kept coming to me as I was listening to that was that it seemed that you two were really focusing in on like a fringe extreme end of like the other side of things, that you would say, this is where these ideas are coming from. Like, let's go back to the source. Like, follow this stream up to the headwaters, up to the where it comes out at the top of the mountain, and like the true source of it, and see what it's really about. And I think that for me myself, I align with like a lot of these like progressive ideas, but I do not adhere to like those more extreme fringe elements that you all were talking about. And I kind of like think what I think and feel what I feel based on what I observe around me. And where the theory like originally came from is sort of like obscured. Like I'm not even aware of that. I just kind of see the current situation and I'm making judgments. And I think you all are saying, well, it's important for you to understand where those things originally came from, but it feels a little bit unfair to take people's like valid viewpoints and perspectives and boil them down into a little tiny cluster, and then shove that cluster into that most extreme. See, if you subscribe to all of this, then like you belong in the group that's following that person who said this thing, that like pedophilia is okay. And that seems a little too reductive. You know what I mean? Because it's the same thing as saying, if you're Mormon, then you believe in polygamy. And I can make that case on paper and say it's in your scriptures, it's in DMT 132 that you carry around, and you say that scripture, so you're a polygamist. You follow it down and choke the muscle mouth, and but like you and I both know that like the broad majority of like mainstream Mormons don't consider themselves polygamists. They look at the FLDS and say that those people are differentiated on the out. And people outside of Mormonism would accuse Mormons of supporting that, but we know that that's not really the case. And it feels almost a little bit like that when you're making that kind of argument. Like, well,
no, I think, you know what I mean? I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that's something that I've thought about, just because, as I explore the what I call the oracles of postmodernism, there's some parallels in terms of like, well, this is kind of like when you talk to Mormons about the things that Joseph Smith taught. And in Joseph Smith's in the criticism of Joseph Smith paradigm, there's a thing. Well, all of his statements came from this claim of divine authority, and when you see that the inconsistencies and the controversies around that impeach his claim of divine authority, then you kind of don't have to really pay attention. You can see that everything else that he said is that was fueled by that core claim is illegitimate, and so you don't really have to shape your life around it. And the thing, I think it would be very tempting, and I've seen a lot of people online do this, where all they say is, you know what, Foucault was actually a pedophile, and he was just creating a philosophy to justify his pedophilia. Therefore, anyone who uses or cites Foucault is a pedophile or supports pedophilia. And I think that is a clumsy, illegitimate argument to make. And what I hope
poisoning the well.
Yeah, exactly. So because you can have people who are problematic who can still come up with some things that are useful to understand, and those ideas stand for themselves apart from the nature of the person themselves. So the case that I think bears out if you go through that 5-hour podcast is Foucault. It appears that he did. And he very explicitly makes the argument that he believes that our society we should look at our society through the lens of moral relativism. And his arguments are based on this concept that that truth is just an expression of power, and that any attempt to tie some form of objective reality to truth is just a way to protect and reinforce that power. And really, and this goes more in depth when you get into Derrida and the deconstructing language and how truth is expressed. But what I hope to make the case for is that if you do adopt not the pedophilia, but the principle of moral and cultural relativism that he lays out, then he, in his own life, showed that it can lead to pedophilia and justified pedophilia. And so if you say, you know what, I really like a lot of what Foucault said, but I don't believe in pedophilia, then what that presents to you is an option to say, well, wait a second. If he believed this and it led to pedophilia, but I agree with this, but I don't think it leads to pedophilia, what is the principle? What is the difference in my mind that allows me to accept what he said, but not accept pedophilia? And then find what that principle is, and then say, well, where does that principle come from? And trace yourself back and just explore the genealogy of your own ideas and your own principles, and keep yourself open to the ideas that maybe some of these contradictions might lead you to question the degree to which things like moral relativism or radical skepticism, because a lot of these things are just assertions by philosophers that can't really necessarily be falsified or proven untrue or true. They're just assertions. And so tracing back your own understanding, trying to formulate a firm foundation for why you believe what you believe, and then challenging that with these different ideas like postmodernism, I think is important to do. And it's part of what, my own journey has been on, because Foucault, he's not just this guy who writes weird stuff, but he's like one of the most cited scholars in history. Like, he has more citations, more of the body of knowledge that is out there today is built on the foundation that he laid than almost any other person. So it's really important to understand and try to, wrestle with that subject matter. And it sounds like you are on that journey. I actually have to cut my stream short now, but I really appreciate your call and your perspective and questions on that.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Take care. All right. Bye now. Okay. So this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Certainly share your own perspective on this stuff in the comments. And until next time, I will say hasta la pasta.